Long before foreign sails pierced the horizon, there was an island that lived in quiet harmony with the sea. It was not yet shaped by conquest or renamed by outsiders. It was known by its people through a word that carried meaning deeper than geography, a name that reflected land, spirit, and identity all at once. To them, a name that reflected land, spirit, and identity all at once. To them, the island was not something to own. It was something to belong to. The people who lived there understood the rhythms of nature in ways outsiders would never fully grasp. They planted crops in fertile soil, fished the surrounding waters, and built communities that were guided not by domination, but by balance. Leadership existed, but it was rooted in responsibility rather than control. Their stories were not written in books. They were spoken, sung, and remembered. And for generations that was enough. One day the horizon changed. Strange vessels appeared, massive structures unlike anything the islanders had seen before. They moved with purpose, cutting through the water with silent determination. At first, curiosity overshadowed fear. Visitors arrived. They came with unfamiliar language, unfamiliar clothing, and unfamiliar intentions. Their arrival did not begin with violence. It began with observation, exchange, and cautious interaction. But beneath that calm surface, something far more permanent had already begun. The newcomers saw not just an island, but an opportunity. Within a short time, the balance of life began to shift. The land was claimed in the name of a distant crown. Systems were imposed that redefined ownership, labor, and power. The people who once lived freely now found themselves under control. The transformation was swift and devastating. The newcomers introduced a system that demanded labor, relentless, exhausting, and enforced. The island's original inhabitants were forced to work in fields, mines, and construction, often under harsh and unforgiving conditions. But the greatest destruction did not come from labor alone. It came from something unseen. Illness spread rapidly, strange diseases that the islanders had never encountered before. Without immunity, entire communities fell within a short time. Families disappeared, villages became silent. The collapse of the old world was not gradual, it was overwhelming. Yet even in the face of such loss, something remained, something that refused to surrender completely. At some point, a realization emerged among the survivors. The newcomers were not invincible. There had been whispers, assumptions, even beliefs that these outsiders possessed powers beyond human limits. But doubt began to grow, and doubt turned into action. A test was carried out, simple but powerful. It revealed a truth that changed everything. The newcomers were no different from them in one crucial way. They could die. That realization ignited something long suppressed. The island's people began to organize. Leaders rose, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. They gathered those willing to fight, those unwilling to accept complete submission. And then resistance began. The uprising was fierce, driven by desperation and courage. But it was also uneven. The newcomers had weapons, reinforcements, and strategies shaped by conquest in other lands. The resistance, though powerful in spirit, struggled against overwhelming force. In the end, the rebellion was crushed. But its impact could not be erased. It marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the island's future, a refusal to accept domination without a fight. As time moved forward, the island changed again. The original population had been drastically reduced. But the land did not remain empty. Instead, a new chapter began, one that would reshape the island's identity forever. People were brought from distant lands across the ocean, not by choice, but by force. They arrived in chains, taken from their homes and placed into a system that demanded labor and obedience. They brought with them languages, beliefs, music, and traditions. Though they were stripped of freedom, they were not stripped of identity. Over time, something remarkable happened. The remnants of the island's original people, the newly arrived laborers, and the settlers from distant lands began to blend, not just physically, but culturally. Food changed, music evolved, language adapted. The island became something new, a place where multiple worlds collided and slowly fused into one. As the population grew more diverse, those in power began to take notice. They sought to shape the island's identity in a way that aligned with their vision. Policies were introduced to encourage migration from certain regions while discouraging or suppressing others. The goal was clear, to control not just the land but the people who lived on it. New settlers arrived, bringing additional customs and influences. But instead of replacing what already existed, they added to it. The island became layered with culture. No single identity dominated. Instead, it became a blend, complex, evolving, and impossible to simplify. As generations passed, something began to grow beneath the surface: awareness. The people of the island, now shaped by multiple ancestries, began to question the systems that governed them. They saw the inequalities, they felt the limitations placed on their lives, and they began to imagine something different: freedom. Not just from labor systems or economic control, but from external rule entirely. Ideas of independence spread quietly at first, then more openly. Conversations turned into plans, plans turned into action, and eventually the island witnessed another moment of defiance. In the 19th century, that growing desire erupted into open rebellion. It was not just about political control, it was about dignity, about the right to define their own future. Those who rose up knew the risks. They understood the power they were challenging. But they also knew that silence would guarantee nothing would ever change. The rebellion was bold, but it was not enough to overcome the forces against it. Once again, it was suppressed, but like the resistance before it, it left something behind. A message. The desire for freedom was no longer hidden. Not long after, a major shift occurred. The system of forced labor that had shaped much of the island's economy was finally abolished. It was a significant step forward, but it did not solve everything. Because even as one form of control ended, another was on the horizon. A conflict between powerful nations changed the fate of the island once again. Ownership shifted, not to independence but to a new ruling power. For the people of the island, it was a familiar story. Different rulers, same uncertainty. Under new control changes were introduced. Some brought opportunities, new infrastructure, new systems of governance. But others reinforced the reality that the island was still not fully in control of its own destiny. Citizenship was granted, but it came with limitations. Rights existed, but not equally. Decisions were made, but not always by the people most affected by them. This contradiction became a defining feature of life on the island. The desire for self-determination did not disappear. It evolved. New leaders emerged, not necessarily through titles, but through influence. They spoke, organized, and inspired others to question the status quo. Movements formed, protests took place, and once again resistance met opposition. There were moments of tragedy, times when peaceful actions were met with force. Lives were lost, communities were shaken. But even in those moments, the underlying message remained unchanged. The people were not willing to give up their identity. Eventually, the island was given a new political classification, one that offered a degree of self-governance while maintaining a connection to a larger power. It was presented as a solution, but in reality it raised new questions. Was the island truly independent? Was it fully integrated? Or was it something in between? Decades later, those questions still remain. Through all the changes, colonization, forced labor, cultural blending, political shifts, one thing endured: identity. The people of the island did not lose who they were. They adapted, yes, they evolved. They incorporated influences from different cultures. But they did not disappear. Their language remained strong. Their traditions continued. Their sense of belonging, to the island and to each other, endured. They carried forward the memory of where they came from, even when history tried to erase it. The story of this island is not just about what happened to it. It is about what it refused to become. It refused to become silent. It refused to become forgotten. It refused to become something defined entirely by others. Instead, it became something stronger, a place shaped by struggle, resilience, and an unbreakable connection to identity. There are many places in the world that have been conquered, reshaped, and controlled. But not all of them managed to hold on to themselves. This island did, not perfectly, not without loss, but enough to ensure that its voice still exists today. And that voice carries a simple truth. No matter how many times history tries to rewrite a people, those who remember who they are can never truly be erased. The day everything changed did not announce itself with thunder. It came quietly. Strange shapes appeared along the horizon, unnatural against the smooth line where sky met sea. At first they seemed almost unreal, like illusions carried by the ocean. But as they grew closer, curiosity turned into unease. The visitors who stepped onto the island brought with them more than unfamiliar faces. They brought a different way of seeing the world. To them, land was not something to share, it was something to claim. Power was not something to balance, it was something to enforce. At first the interactions were careful, even peaceful. But beneath that fragile calm, intentions hardened, and slowly the island began to change. The transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded in stages. First came agreements, small shifts that seemed manageable. Then came expectations, then demands. Before long, the people of the island found themselves living under rules they had never agreed to. Labor became mandatory, resources were redirected. The land that once provided freely was now controlled. But the most devastating change came from something invisible: sickness. It spread without warning, without understanding. Entire communities fell within weeks. The knowledge of healing that had sustained generations could not stop it. The island began to lose its voice. Songs were no longer sung as often. Ceremonies faded. Stories stopped being told, not because they were forgotten, but because there were fewer people left to remember them. It felt like the end, but it wasn't. Even in the darkest moments, questions began to rise. Who were these newcomers really? Why did they demand so much? And most importantly, were they truly untouchable? For a time, fear had created the illusion that they were something more than human. But illusions do not last forever. One act, simple, deliberate, shattered that belief. And once it was broken, something powerful replaced it: courage. The people who remained began to organize. Not because they believed victory was guaranteed, but because they understood something deeper. To do nothing would mean losing everything. The resistance that followed was not large, but it was fierce. It was driven by memory of what life had been before control. It was fueled by loss of families, of communities, of freedom. They fought with everything they had, but they were outmatched. Weapons, numbers, and experience in warfare gave the newcomers an overwhelming advantage. The resistance was eventually crushed, yet something unexpected happened. Defeat did not erase what had been started. Instead, it planted something that would grow over generations: the idea that resistance was possible. As time moved forward, the island entered a new phase. The population that once defined it had been drastically reduced. But the land did not remain empty. Instead, new people arrived, brought against their will, forced into a system that demanded labor and obedience. They came from distant lands, carrying memories of homes they might never see again. They spoke different languages, practiced different traditions, and carried different histories. At first, their presence was defined by suffering. But over time, something changed. They began to shape the island just as the island shaped them. The blending of cultures did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, in kitchens, in music, in shared struggles. It happened in quiet moments where people found connection despite differences. Food became a fusion of traditions. Music carried rhythms from multiple continents. Language evolved, absorbing influences and creating something entirely new. The island was no longer defined by a single identity. It had become something more complex. Something layered, something unique. Those in power recognized the shift. They saw that the island was becoming something they could not easily categorize or control. And so they tried to reshape it. Policies were introduced. New groups were encouraged to settle. Systems were adjusted to influence the island's direction, but there was one thing they could not fully control: how people saw themselves. Because identity does not come from policies, it comes from experience, and the experience of the island's people was one of resilience. Over time, a new kind of resistance began to form. It was not always loud. It did not always take the form of open conflict. Sometimes it was quiet. It lived in conversations, in shared beliefs, in the refusal to forget. People began to imagine a different future, one where they could define their own path. That idea spread, and eventually it became impossible to contain. The next uprising was different. It was not just about reacting to control. It was about reclaiming identity. Those who rose up knew the risks. They understood the consequences. But they also understood something else. Change would never come without action. The rebellion was bold, but once again it was met with force. And once again it was suppressed. Not long after, the island experienced another transformation. One system of control ended, but another took its place. New rulers brought new promises. Some changes were welcomed, others were questioned. But beneath it all, one truth remained. The island was still not fully in control of its own future. Life under this new system was complex. There were opportunities that had not existed before. But there were also limitations that could not be ignored. People were given a sense of belonging, but not complete participation. They were included, but not equally. This contradiction became part of daily life. And over time it began to shape how people saw themselves and their place in the world. The fight for identity did not disappear. It evolved. Some chose to speak. Others chose to organize. Some resisted openly, others resisted quietly. There were moments of tension, times when the desire for change clashed with the reality of power. And in those moments, history repeated itself. Force was used, lives were lost. But the spirit of resistance remained. Eventually, the island was given a new status, one that seemed to offer balance. A degree of independence, a degree of connection. But not fully either. It was a compromise. And like many compromises, it left questions unanswered. What is the island truly? Who decides its future? And how long can something remain in between before it must choose a direction? Through everything, loss, change, control, resistance, one thing has remained constant. Memory, not just of events, but of identity, of where the island began, of what it has endured, of who its people are. That memory lives in language, in culture, in traditions that continue despite everything that has tried to erase them. The story of this island is not just about surviving history. It is about shaping it. Every generation has added something, whether through resistance, adaptation, or preservation. The result is not a broken identity. It is a strengthened one. There are places that disappear under the weight of history, and there are places that carry it. This island carries it all, the pain, the resistance, the transformation. But it also carries something else, a refusal to be forgotten, a refusal to be redefined completely by others, a refusal to disappear. And as long as that refusal exists, the story is not over. It is still being written.